You are now listening to 1-900 Old Ladies, The Lost Art of Making Lefse, written by Ellie Starr, narrated by the author. Post-production by Pinto Media. Chapter 3. It had been 14 days since Stanley Peters left his poor wife, Ellen, to waste away in their dilapidated North Dakota farmhouse. He left her without warning, penniless and alone. After he packed his suitcase, he had cleaned out the entire contents of his Folgers coffee tin stash and headed for Tucson, Arizona, with the intention of living there with his son, Stanley Jr. Ellie was used to doing without. She grew up a farmer's daughter, the fifth child of 7 children. Her mother died after giving birth to her twin brothers, Lars and Gunnar. She was primarily raised by her father's mother, grandmother Sigrid Sivertsen. Ellie's oldest siblings, Margit, Morton, Norman, and Inga, were born during the height of the Dust Bowl at the beginning of the Great Depression in 1931, 1932, 1933, and 1934, respectively. By the time Ellie was born in 1937, the family's fortunes began to reverse. Still, by the time Ellie's mother died in 1941, good fortune was measured by the fact that one simply didn't have to go to sleep hungry every night. There were plenty of times, especially after the dust storms of 33, 34, and 35, where even Father considered packing everything up and simply abandoning the family farm. Ellen surmised that her mother's influence had more to do with her father's decision to ride out the bad times. She passed away when Ellen was just 4, and Ellen hardly remembered anything about her, but she understood from stories told by her older sister Margie that her mother, Marguerite, had descended from French-Canadian fur traders. Her mother's mother was a Native American from the Mandan tribe. Ellie's mother was crafty, highly intelligent, resourceful, and reportedly very hard-headed. It was easy to see how a soft-spoken guy like her father could fall for such a dynamic woman. Ellen concluded that Margie was probably a lot like Mother was. Ellen's father was pure Norwegian stock, born and raised in North Dakota. Grandfather Sivertsen's parents had barely settled here in 1879 from Norway when he was born. Grandmother Sivertsen's family, however, moved to the state much later, a little after the turn of the century. That was after the railroad had begun setting up land offices in parts of Scandinavia and Germany, enticing farmers to emigrate to North Dakota. Grandfather Sivertsen spoke English with a typical Midwestern accent. Grandmother Sivertsen still had a very distinct Norwegian accent. She was 10 years old when she moved to North Dakota with her parents. She met Grandfather Sivertsen as a young girl. When they were old enough, they married and started a family of their own. Later in life, after Grandmother Sivertsen had passed on and Stanley Jr. was small, Ellie would watch reruns of old movies on television. She loved Ingrid Bergman pictures because the actress's voice and accent reminded her of time she spent with her grandmother. Sometimes she wouldn't watch the movie at all. She would simply lie back, close her eyes, and imagine her grandmother there in the room with her, talking to her. Grandmother Sivertsen was a smart and practical woman. She was extremely frugal, as was her son and Ellie's father, Anders. Father was a plain man of few words. He worked on the farm, rising often before the sun did, and often coming home extremely late after the sun had set. His philosophy was that one should work hard until one simply collapsed from exhaustion. Then one rested a few short hours before getting up to do it all over again. Her father never had to say much to get his point across. He was very strict, but Ellie really only recalled a few occasions where Father actually lost his temper. Usually, it was always for good reason, and if he chose to administer discipline to one of her misbehaving siblings, they most certainly deserved whatever they had coming. Neither Father nor Grandmother Sivertsen were very emotional people. It was often instilled upon the children that it was essential to keep one's feelings to oneself. But Ellie did recall the night her mother gave birth to the twins and subsequently died. Ellie was 4 years old, and she recalled watching her father, for the first and only time ever, sitting at the kitchen table with his face in his hands, outwardly weeping for the loss of his wife. Even though Grandmother Sievertson never seemed to grant Ellie's mother 1 ounce of respect for being, as she called her, a red-skinned savage, her father always seemed to regard Ellen's mother with genuine respect and love. He was never the same man after Mother died, and until Father passed away in 1957, he never found another wife to replace the one he had so tragically lost. Ellen was hungry. She was penniless, cold, and her cupboards were bare. She had to think up something to do to get enough food, wood, and cash for the winter. It was obvious that Stanley wasn't coming back, and she needed to be the woman Grandmother Sievertson had trained her to be. She needed to be resourceful. Ellie dug through her kitchen drawer to find the latest number she had for her sister Margie in Wauchula, Florida. Then she dialed Margie's number on her rotary wall phone. Margie's husband, John Carter, answered the ringing line. At that moment, he happened to be standing next to the cordless handset, which was plugged into the kitchen wall socket of their small trailer house. "Well, hello, Ellie dear," John greeted. "How the heck are you, honey?" John Carter was always fond of his sister-in-law. "Sure, doll, I'll get her for you." He placed his hand over the receiver and handed the phone to his wife. He mouthed the words, "Your sister." Margie smiled and spoke into the handset. "Hello, darling. What's up?" she inquired. Ellen recounted the events of the past few weeks to Margie in detail, informing her that Stanley had left her to move to Tucson. "That friggin' dickhead. Well, dear, it's for the best. I've always told you should have dumped his sorry ass a long time ago. You're much better off. If only his son, Robert, hadn't died in Nam. I've always thought that you two would have made the perfect couple." Margie Carter was never one to mince words. She always told it like it was. In addition, she was always uninhibited about sex or most anything that would have embarrassed ordinary people. She talked boldly, candidly, and as frequently as she could about anything sexual in nature. If someone stated anything with mixed messages, she always interpreted its meaning in the filthiest way possible. As a young girl, she was a tomboy. Unlike her sisters and most girls her age, she chose to wear boys' overalls. Of course, she had to wear dresses to school, but she took any other opportunity outside of the schoolroom to wear pants, which were less restrictive than dresses. She loved to get dirty, and she wasn't squeamish about anything unpleasant. The name Margie was actually a nickname for Margot, but nobody called her that unless her grandmother, father, or sister Inga were angry at her. Otherwise, she was simply known to friends and family as Marge or Margie. Marge, like her two oldest brothers, Morton and Norman, was slightly darker in complexion than the 4 youngest children, Inga, Ellen, Lars, and Gunnar. The older children favored their mother Marguerite. Margie's face had strong Aryan features and mysterious green eyes, but her complexion was darker, and her natural hair color was a medium ash brown. Her Native American and French heritage was evident in her looks, as well as the looks of her brothers Morton and Norman. Because Margie, Morton, and Norman had significantly darker complexions and coloring than their younger brothers and sisters, Grandmother Sievertson often told the children and family that the 3 oldest children were not fathered by Anders Sievertson. Instead, she accused the French whore, Sigrid's nickname for her daughter-in-law, of philandering with other not-so-white men of the town. She believed that Anders married Marguerite to make a respectable woman out of her, because she was pregnant with Margie when they wed. But she was adamant throughout her lifetime that Margie and her 2 oldest brothers were not Anders' children. The youngest 4 children, who all possessed perfect Scandinavian features, were clearly worthy of their father's name. Although Sigrid Sivertson told the children quite boldly that they were or were not fathered by Anders, depending on which child they were, she never repeated her suspicions to Anders himself. The truth was that although Margie, Morton, and Norman didn't favor their father as much as they resembled their mother, they were just as much his as the younger siblings were. But Grandmother Sivertson's failure to recognize Margie, Morton, and Norman as true Sivertson descendants did not sit well with any of the children and caused a great deal of deep-seated resentment and prejudice among them. One day in the summer of 1947, shortly after the twins Lars and Gunnar had turned 6, the two approached Margie and Morton, who sat reclining on a stump, sucking the nectar out of some white clover. Margie and Morton were 16 and 15 respectively. Inga, who was 13, and Ellen, who was 10, also sat with them. Often the children didn't have much time to just sit and loiter because they were usually performing chores on the farm. Norman was out in the field, assisting father. Lars sneered at Margie. "Grandmother Sigrid says you're not Dad's kids." Margie, who had been leaning back on her elbows, leaned forward to spit out a piece of straw upon which she had been gnawing. Then she grabbed Lars and drew his pale little face toward hers, holding his chin about 2 inches from her own. "What did you say?" She lifted her brow in a threatening manner while speaking to her youngest brother. "Grandmother says you and Morton and Norman aren't white. She says you're not our dads," Gunnar repeated, standing behind his twin brother, unafraid. Margie knew that Grandmother Sivertson didn't regard the 3 oldest children as belonging to her son, and she knew that her twin brothers were simply repeating what they had heard their grandmother tell them their entire lives. But she wasn't going to let the little imps get away with smearing her mother's good name simply because her grandmother was a racist. Margie motioned at Morton and pointed to Gunnar. "Grab his feet. Let's go." With one fell swoop, Margie jumped to her feet, reached over, and grabbed Lars by the ankles, flipping him upside down. Morton did the same with Gunnar. The 2 oldest siblings walked the twins the 50 steps to the dual-holed outhouse located behind the barn. "It looks like some little snobs need to be taught a lesson," Margie cried. By this time, each of the twins were yelling, "Put us down, Margie!" Inga and Ellie followed behind. Margie opened the latrine door and entered, suspending Lars upside down above one of the 2 holes of the privy. Morton did the same with Gunnar at the other hole. All the while, the twins screamed hysterically. The blood rushed to their heads, and their faces were now bright red, partly also because they were mad and crying. Ellie and Inga watched the entire episode. Ellie begged her oldest sister sympathetically, "Don't, Margie, please." Inga, who was the family tattletale, warned, "I'm going to tell Grandmother." "Go right ahead, you little snitch. I'll get you later," Margie threatened. Inga ran off to search for Sigrid. The twins continued to scream as Margie and Morton kept them suspended upside down above the holes of the latrine. Ellie held her nose and tried not to sniff in the unpleasant odor of human excrement which pervaded the air. Margie calmly instructed the screaming twins. "I'll let you down if you say the magic words. Now, what do you say?" Lars hesitated. Margie dropped him 5 inches closer to the latrine hole opening before stopping herself. "Feel like taking a swim? Now, what do you say?" "I'm sorry," Lars resigned. "Me too," Gunnar also gave in. Ellie begged Margie once more and tapped her on the arm. With tearful eyes, she pleaded, "Please, Margie, put them down." Margie relented. She and Morton released the twins, dropping them carefully on their heads before they darted away, screaming and sobbing. They met up with Grandmother Sivertson on her way out to the shithouse. She was followed by Inga, who had dutifully reported everything that went on. Sigrid confronted Margie and Morton, who still stood standing in front of the privy. "What's happening in there? What's going on?" Sigrid inquired of her granddaughter. She hugged the twins, who were still sobbing. Inga devilishly peered out from behind her grandmother's apron. Margie brushed herself off and exchanged a look of collusion with her oldest brother and fellow cohort in crime. Then she gazed at her grandmother with an impertinent grin and answered, "Nothing, grandmother. Just a tiny misunderstanding. Everything's fine." Margie then walked back to the house, past her suspicious grandmother, while Morton followed. She plucked off another piece of straw and resumed her gnawing. As she strutted off, she hummed to herself. Ellie, still a little shaken and teary, chased after her big sister. As Margie grew older, she became aware of her own unique combination of overt sexuality and innate beauty. There was something exotic about her that people couldn't quite place. Mandan tribesmen were significantly lighter in complexion than other native tribes prevalent in North Dakota. But her combination of green eyes, Aryan bone structure, and long, dark hair made her striking and unlike her fairer brothers and sisters. She wasn't quite Scandinavian, but she wasn't exactly full-blooded Indian. Early in her life, she was often insulted and hurt by her grandmother's repeated comments regarding her alleged illegitimacy. But as Margie grew older, she learned to laugh off Sigrid's comments for what they were: simple ignorance. As Margie became a young woman, she realized that she was regarded as one of the most desirable young women in town. She consequently decided that she would use her good looks to her advantage by finding a way out of the state. She first moved to Rapid City, South Dakota, and initially got herself a job waiting tables at a local diner. She met her future husband, John, while attending a party at the Ellsworth Air Force Base. After John was deployed to Korea, she joined the USO as a dancer in one of their overseas shows. As fate would have it, she and John met again in Tokyo and quickly married there during one of his R&Rs. After the war, John continued to serve in the Air Force for 4 more years. He was stationed in Jacksonville, Florida, when Margie gave birth to their first and second sons, Eugene and Joseph. After John's time in the Air Force, the family moved to South Florida, where John worked speculating in real estate. Margie had 2 more daughters, Penny and Caroline. For 30 years, they lived in a cozy neighborhood in Homestead. That was until Hurricane Andrew swept through South Florida last summer and destroyed their home and almost the entire city of Homestead in its wake. All Margie's children had since gone on to jobs or college and had moved away. When the hurricane annihilated Margie's home and all its contents, Margie and John decided to take the few possessions that remained and move to Wauchula until the insurance company could rebuild their home. A lot of homes had been destroyed, and it would take years to restore the devastated town. Ellen quizzed Margie on the phone about her life in Wauchula. She lived in a tiny, rusted trailer, probably built in the early 70s. The kitchen shelving was avocado green, and the carpeting throughout was a multicolored orange shag. Each trailer had exactly 12 feet of open space between it and each of the neighboring trailers in the park. And Margie wasn't sure that some of the other park residents weren't all members of one single inbred family. She was still trying to wrap her head around their exact relationship. Ultimately, for people like Margie and John, who had grown up in a plain state with lots of wide open spaces, this little crampy trailer park of inbred crackers was almost suffocating. But they managed to keep their spirits up because they considered their present living situation only a temporary one. And, despite everything they had lost, Margie still had John. "I feel like a friggin' sardine here," Margie confided in Ellie over the phone. Ellie quizzed her about the progress of the construction of her home and homestead. "Well, It seems we owe twice as much on the house as it will be worth when we replace it. It's a long story, but John and I are very pissed about that. We don't know what we're going to do right now. John's doctor seems to think he needs a stress test and other stuff we really can't afford. He's retired, but he's not eligible for Medicare for another 3 years, so everything is out of pocket. No, the hospital here in Wauchula is closed because of that whole baby swapping thing, so we have to drive all the way to Avon Park to see his doctor. John took our last $100,000 in savings and found a guy who was selling offshore investments in the Turks and Caicos, and he sank every last penny into that. So all of our funds are tied up right now. Margie decided to find out more about Ellie's condition. Really, honey, how are you doing? Did Stanley take everything with? He didn't even leave you a dime? Ellie confirmed that Stanley had left her destitute. Oh, honey, I wish I had something to send you. I used the last $500 on my credit card to buy some 900 numbers that John wanted me to buy. I don't know. It was some motivational home-based business seminar we went to in Tampa. Can you believe he wants me to start a sex chat line in order to make extra money? He says I have a sexy voice. She laughed. I tell you, Ellie, that man is so nuts. He's been into almost every harebrained scheme ever concocted. He lost his shirt when the Broward Savings and Loan went defunct. Margie sighed. Things haven't been good for us financially either. And in the bedroom, well, let me tell you, I have officially traded in my organ for an accordion. John needs like 3 months of foreplay before he can get it up anymore. John sat listening to Margie's end of the phone conversation. She grinned at her husband while continuing her frank discussion with Ellie. Yeah, if he wasn't so damn sexy, I would have to leave him for somebody who could perform better in bed. She leaned over to kiss John. You know I love you, baby, she whispered to him. Then she snickered. Ellie was used to Marge's frank discussions about sex, but that still didn't prevent her from blushing on the other end of the landline. Margie almost seemed to enjoy embarrassing her younger sister, who was about as sexually inhibited as Margie was uninhibited. Actually, Margie seemed to enjoy embarrassing anyone, close friend or perfect stranger, with her frank conversations about sex. If I were you, honey, I would pawn every last bit of shit that prick of a husband owns before he comes back. After all, it's your stuff, too. You worked your ass off for 25 years as a teacher. Where was he? Sitting on his ass, leeching off you all his life. The only thing he ever managed to do is get his ass shot off in the war and impregnate you as Stanley Jr. Why don't you sell his gun collection? Surely someone in the town is interested in buying that crap. Have an auction or something. Ellie argued with Margie about the feasibility of selling Stanley's things, especially when he left explicit instructions to leave all his possessions alone. Margie knew that Ellie had no intention of selling Stanley's things, even if it meant that she might starve and freeze over the winter. I'm telling you, Ellie, honey, listen to me. Sell his shit, sell the farm, do what I did, and move out of that godforsaken hellhole before he gets back. Look, you can't be afraid of that asshole. Just do it. Come live with us. We have an extra room here, and we'll have the new house built soon. Let me know what I can do, honey. Listen, Ellie, I gotta go. Hell, this must be costing you a fortune. But I'll call you soon, okay? In a sing-songy voice, she abruptly terminated the conversation. Okay, love you, bye-bye. Then she hung up the phone. John sat down next to his wife at the breakfast counter, which was really just a short partition between the kitchen and the tiny trailer's living room. He had heard enough of Margie's end of the conversation to figure out what went on. Stanley left Ellie, eh? Yeah, she should have left him 25 years ago. It's hard to read Ellie, but she's probably devastated, Margie answered. Ah, he was a bonehead anyway. She's better off, John agreed. John moved closer to Margie and whispered into her ear. They never had what we had, right, Margie, baby? He started to breathe heavily and nuzzle his nose against her neck. Margie smiled. Except for that night they made Stanley Jr., I'm not sure they ever had that. Then Margie seemed to pick up on her husband's romantic advances. Why, Mr. Carter, are you trying to tell me something? Ooh, you naughty man. John Carter grabbed his wife's hand, leading her into the back bedroom of their Wauchula trailer house. Miss Johann Sebastian, I think your organ is now ready for the concert. Am I playing for the funeral? We're going to bury a stiff. Margie laughed and pushed her husband into the back bedroom. John let out a couple of good whoops and hollers before they finally shut the bedroom door.